Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today Mike D asks, why is cereal considered a breakfast food? For kids who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, it was sugary cereal commercials that dotted the television landscape, featuring lucky leprechauns, wisecracking droids, and adorable gremlins. A common theme among all of these was advocating these products were a magical part of a complete breakfast, helping to ingrain that idea into our collective mindset. Of course, anyone who has even a modicum of knowledge about proper nutrition knows that regularly partaking in a massive dose of extremely calorie-dense sugary cereal is not at all needed nor advisable in a complete breakfast. So, how did we get here? What did people historically eat for breakfast? And who was the first to claim that eating cereals like mini ETs was a nutritious way to start the day? Well, to begin with, both large groups of people eating breakfast and large groups choosing to skip it is nothing new. While the Iliad and the Odyssey make mention of soldiers and manual laborers eating a meal very close to the start of the day, with items on the menu being things like barley bread, olives, figs, and wine, many in the ancient world did not eat breakfast at all. In fact, as far as a set meal goes, it wasn't uncommon to choose to only eat one large meal towards the end of the day. For instance, according to food historian Caroline Yelton, outside of the aforementioned individuals like campaign soldiers and those who spent their days doing intensive manual labor, many ancient Romans did not typically eat a morning meal. Indeed, they preferred the previous option of having a very large meal sometime in the afternoon around 3 or 4 o'clock. That said, for those Romans who did eat a morning meal, with that meal called jetaculum, it seems they ate things like bread, olives, raisins, cheeses, and nuts, washing it down with some sort of wine-based beverage, somewhat similar to the ancient Greeks. As for the legionary on the go, they ate things such as porridge made from wheat and barley which was soaked in water. In all cases, this was essentially pre-prepared or quick-to-make and eat food that provided what the body needed to sustain high energy output throughout the morning. The trend toward abstaining from breakfast at all saw a huge upsurge during the Middle Ages, with many opting for a two-meal system, one around noon and one in the evening. Eating a meal shortly after walking during this period in the Western world seems to have been largely considered a form of gluttony, as noted by 13th century priest Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. That is not to say that nobody ate breakfast, however, even in this anti-breakfast era in the Western world. Those requiring a lot of calories to get through the day generally ate things like rye bread and beer in the morning, though it appears the more devout of these individuals tended to take their desire for a morning meal as a sign of moral weakness, and their giving into it as something of a sinful act. Unsurprisingly, given manual laborers tended to be poor, beyond being considered somewhat gluttonous, eating breakfast in this era also tended to be looked down upon by the affluent as something only poor people did. It was also during this time that the midday meal, which, as mentioned, for many in the Western world was the first meal of the day, was actually called dinner. This is from the Old French word disnar, which meant breakfast. So, in other words, lunch was breakfast and it was called dinner. It was during the 14th and 15th centuries that adding a meal between last night's feast and the midday one started coming into fashion for all classes. In fact, the English word breakfast dates back to the mid-15th century, when it, unsurprisingly, literally meant to break the fast between two meals. Within a few centuries, breakfast became normalized, and there are records of it being pushed as the most important meal of the day, going all the way back to the early 18th century, with those who could afford such items eating things like eggs, tea, and coffee, along with classic breakfast items like bread, nuts, and fruits. In fact, by the mid-18th century, certain of the English elite even started building designated breakfast rooms. This finally brings us to the 19th century and the more direct genesis of the sugary breakfast cereal we have today. It was in this era that many Americans were suffering from dyspepsia or indigestion, seemingly caused by a high-protein, high-fat diet largely composed of fatty meats and not nearly enough fiber. Symptoms of this included upper abdominal pain as well as bloating. To combat this and other real and perceived ailments, alternate breakfast items began popping up, generally attempting to avoid meats and animal fats altogether. On top of this, with the Industrial Revolution, breakfast became less about socializing and more about quick consumption. The factory workers needed their caloric intake but didn't have enough time to prepare or eat a full sit-down meal. And this is where breakfast cereals enter the picture. The first modern designated breakfast cereal, forms of porridge aside, was invented in 1863 by a vegetarian Christian abolitionist doctor who was called James Caleb Jackson. Created for his sanatorium patients as a healthy start to the day, it was comprised of crumbled, twice-baked graham flour, which is essentially a type of non-bleached, all-natural, finely ground whole wheat flour, and bran, hard outer layer of the grain, he called granula. The end product resembled a much hardier version of the modern Grape-Nuts, but with significantly larger nuggets. This breakfast substance was so hard that apparently it needed to be soaked in liquid for at least 20 to 30 minutes before it could comfortably be bitten into. In the 1870s, Dr. John Kellogg ran his own sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was known for his very strange, sometimes sadistically abusive methods, including electrically shocking children's genitals, applying forms of acid to them, removal of the clitoris in females, and circumcising males, all in an attempt to prevent masturbation and sexual urges. Interestingly, the latter male circumcision treatment, as something commonly performed in America, actually hails from this era. The modern non-Jewish, non-Islamic practice of foreskin removal was not really a thing in the Western world until it began to be seen as a way to prevent masturbation. You can see our video, Why Do Men Get Circumcised, for more information on that. In any event, Dr. Kellogg visited Jackson's retreat and was most impressed with his granula, so impressed in fact that he ripped off the idea, creating his own version of it made from wheat, corn, and ground oats. He uninventively called it granula, and as a result Jackson sued and Kellogg was forced to rename his cereal to granola. A few years later, a failed Battle Creek suspender salesman named Charles W. Post partially knocked off Kellogg's product and started selling an exceptionally similar granola product that he called Grape-Nuts, claiming that it could make one's red blood redder. As with Jackson, Kellogg and Post both pushed this food item as an ideal, healthy food to start the day with. This set the trend that has continued through today for this type of product. Between Kellogg and Post at the turn of the 20th century, Battle Creek became a battleground for two companies that would come to define the world of breakfast cereal. For instance, legend has it that due to a mishap making a batch of the original version of Graham crackers, originally created by Presbyterian minister Sylvester Graham as a way to curb sexual urges, John Kellogg and his brother Will invented a product they unimaginatively dubbed Corn Flakes. Post was a little more flamboyant, naming his version of the same thing Elijah's manna. This was meant as a striking allusion to the biblical story about the food that saved the wandering, starving Israelites. With the famed prophet sitting on a rock and hand-feeding a raven on the front of the box, Elijah became the first cereal mascot. However, fairly quickly religious groups protested, and Post changed the name to Post Toasties. Ultimately, the Kellogg brothers split over Will Kellogg's decision to recommend adding sugar to cornflakes to help it sell better. This was something that Dr. John Kellogg found borderline blasphemous. In his opinion, it encouraged sexual excitement. The two parted way, with Will founding the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, which went on to become the now billion-dollar Kellogg Corporation. Kellogg, besides their tasty flakes, were soon to also introduce another breakfast staple, Rice Krispies. His brother John Kellogg stuck to his original principles and continued to dedicate his life to ridding the world of such evils as masturbation. Now, given the ladies of the house at this time tended to be the ones who decided what the family would eat, during the first few decades of the 20th century, cereal advertising was primarily aimed at housewives. Kellogg's told women to wink at their grocer and see what they got, and the answer, of course, was a box of Corn Flakes. Quaker Oats likewise sponsored radio dramas and midday radio shows aimed at housewives. Post told mums that bringing up kids on their cereals would help them later in life. In the late 1930s, as breakfast cereal became more established and commonly purchased anyway, cereal companies started thinking that it might be best to avoid the middlewoman and instead market directly to children who presumably would then pester their mothers to buy the cereal that they wanted. For instance, in 1936, a Dennis the Menace-like character named Skippy was used specifically to market Wheaties to children. The problem here is that children tend to not like straight bran or wheat, but they sure do love sugar. In 1939, the first pre-sugar-coated cereal was produced, called Ranger Joe Wheat Honeys. Ironically, the product was actually an effort by the creator to minimize how much additional sugar kids commonly put on their cereal by including a relatively small, regulated amount. But instead of curbing the practice of over-sugaring cereal, it eventually resulted in the opposite, starting with post-copying Ranger Joe Wheat Honeys with their own version called Sugar Crisp in 1949. Then, thanks to a major breakfast cereal producer making a version of this, the rest of the industry followed suit. By the 1960s, cereal companies were devoting approximately 90% of their advertising budgets to directly appealing to individuals of the youthful persuasion. This is why it's so common today to have prizes in the cereal box, tie-ins with movies, video games, and TV shows, and products called Sprinkles, Spangle, and Ice Cream Cone cereal. On that note, this is also why adding more and more sugar to breakfast cereal became a thing. As for widespread claims by the manufacturers that these cereals are part of a complete breakfast, technically, the cereal companies are not lying here. Unsurprisingly, given the three primary nutrient groups known as macronutrients that humans need to survive are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, according to the American Chemical Society, a healthy breakfast should consist of mostly carbohydrates and proteins. That's a shocker, I know. And indeed, cereal, even if it's simply a bowl of pure sugar, does contain carbs. So these products can indeed technically be considered an essential part of a complete breakfast, just perhaps not an advisable one given the vast majority are essentially candy, which is cleverly marketed to appear nutritious. Indeed, cereal boxes often have on the side of the packet a big thing showing all of the vitamins that they contain, along with a tiny thing saying the recommended serving size. But indeed, no one follows this and simply pours a huge bowl of calories and sugar. But to be fair, combined with certain other breakfast items in extreme moderation, this staple of the breakfast world could potentially be useful if one leads a very physically active life, instead of just rolling out of bed only to very soon sit at a desk all day and then come home and sit on the couch until bedtime. On that note, perhaps those sedentary, wealthy aristocrats of old were onto something in choosing to skip the morning meal. And for those who led a life full of manual labor, it is perhaps no surprise that some form of grain-based morning meal seems to have been the choice that people made throughout most of recorded history. It's easy, it's quick to eat, and it has a mix of simple and complex carbohydrates which provide both quick and relatively long-lasting stores of energy, all while avoiding too much protein and fat, which, while otherwise essential for life and important for things like maintaining muscle mass, might not sit well when eating mostly that in the morning and then jumping right in to hard labor. And now for some bonus facts. Funnily enough, while you might think products like Grape-Nuts or Corn Flakes would offer better alternatives to more sugary breakfast cereals, at least in terms of avoiding a blood sugar spike, it should be noted that Grape-Nuts has a glycemic index of 71. For the uninitiated, the GI is a scale showing the effect of a given food item on one's blood sugar levels, with 100 being pure glucose. This is surprisingly higher than sugary cereals such as Fruit Loops with 69 and Frosted Flakes with about 55. For further reference, Corn Flakes has a mean GI of about 81 and Rice Krispies are 82, while table sugar only has a GI of 60. That being said, good nutrition is a lot more complicated than just looking at a single number, and there is definitely a place for food items high on the GI scale, particularly ones that offer other benefits like lots of fiber and micronutrients. It's just pretty surprising how high the vast majority of breakfast cereals, even seemingly non-sugary ones like Grape-Nuts, are on that index. And now for another bonus fact. In 1941, Cheerios were introduced as a ready-to-eat oat cereal. The name emphasized the main ingredient to differentiate itself from the numerous other brands out there whose products were generally made of things like wheat. Unfortunately for Cheerios, Quaker Oats took offense to their name, claiming the oats part infringed on their trademark. While it is highly unlikely that Quaker Oats would have won in court, in order to avoid the issue altogether, the name was changed to Cheerios in 1945. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do do hit that subscribe button below. We put out brand new videos every day of the week. Also, let me thank our patrons on Patreon. If you are interested in supporting this show and helping us keep making these daily videos, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. We have some great perks lined up for people who do support us, so please check that out at patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut, or check the link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.